I thought it was an excellent day, and I thought it was a series of very interesting presentations and papers. What it reminded me of is what one's seeing with a lot of issues, where it's very difficult to get consensus. There are many options. There is a huge need to resolve those and to unite behind a program that people share. But as we heard today, there were those who aligned along the nuclear option. There were those that felt that there was inadequate time and effort given to the renewables. And so I think that's, in a microcosm, very clearly an issue that if we're going to find solutions and move quickly, somehow we have to build consensus. Well, a lot of these issues are driven by legislation, and a lot of the environmental adaptations and technologies that have come to force have been as a result of legislation. So when you saw the concern about the hole in the ozone layer, it was legislation that drove it. It was industry that came up with the solutions, alternatives to CFCs and HCFCs. I think that you will see the same, but it'll be much more complex in energy. And the question is, people like liquid energy or energy down a wire. They're a bit suspicious of other sources as that's reliability, but it can all help. I think that at the moment we don't have the consensus to be quick. You know, the whole debate around the nuclear option and things like that. But I think we will, if the urgency becomes more apparent, then I think you will see quicker action. People work on fear and taxation better than they do on voluntary association with solutions. You will get some that do that, but in the end, this will be driven by clever legislation. 10, 15 years ago, policies were often said to be based on good science and good economics. Increasingly, progress is made on perception, public opinion, focus groups, and media coverage. And to some extent, science, what would worry me is that the targets that have been set by the EU, we don't have the science and the knowledge in place. And this comes back to the underinvestment in the knowledge agenda and the technology agenda, which was alluded to in the latter stages of today. And without that investment, some of the risk and uncertainty that people will choose to prevent progress, as we heard it a little bit on in the panel this afternoon, there were those who said climate change is definite. There were those who said, really, there isn't enough evidence to say, but it's criminal to use fossil fuels negligently or in other ways, unless one had thought it through. So I think that, to my mind, it comes back to consensus. You can say it's political leadership, but unpopular governments don't get re-elected. That's why the Commission is unpopular, because it introduced legislation and people blame the Commission for doing it. And so there's a lot of things in there that need to be, shall we say, put in line. Other than that, what do we do with the energy? It's how do you build popularity and support? Some of these solutions on energy will create tensions elsewhere. And that, to some extent, is going to be very difficult to move forward on all fronts. If we run out of food or we run out of water, that will become a much more pressing issue than simply not having enough power in the wire. If you start introducing legislation, as is already in the case, to penalise certain models of car, it will be interesting to see whether people will just afford it because it is a luxury they wish to have, rather than it becoming a curb to them having gas guzzlers. And in some cases, it will become a status symbol to continue with a high energy consuming car. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, our solution was to have a convention. You've got a problem, we have a convention or a treaty, and you all give up a little sovereignty in favour of a greater gain. global benefits, etc., etc. I leave you to really think as to whether the environmental agreements that we've got work. And I think there is a question as to whether they do work. I think the Montreal Protocol is probably the only one that's worked properly. But Kyoto / climate change has become a battleground of transatlantic ideologies and things like that. The Convention on Biological Diversity has become a battleground on who owns the biodiversity and who controls it, and net result, less investment. So I think there is an issue that would have said we need an energy convention, say. I think the track history is that that's not worked terribly well. Can you do it through political leadership? That means going back to the UN or the Climate Change Convention. Is the Climate Change Convention the place to talk about energy? Probably not. Should you go back to the major energy companies, the Shells, the BPs and people like that who've got an awful lot of investment in it? They've been left out of a lot of the negotiations so far. Maybe they should be in the story because they will be the ones, they're switching from being petrocarbons to being energy companies. And it saves them. And in the US, you see that it actually pays some energy generators to help households install insulation simply to avoid the capitalization of increasing power generation capacity. And that's, I don't know whether I came across clearly enough, but that's basically them saying it's cheaper to invest in the user than just to increase the supply side because of all that comes from it. And so I think there are models around the world that one might follow, but how you get this global movement, given our inability to line up amongst most things, and with the so-called war on terror soaking up any spare resources that there are, then I think it's quite difficult to see. And I think we will have more damage done. My concern about new institutions is that it's like treaties. They get bogged down in their own bureaucracy and importance. And we've achieved a lot more when people have decided they want to do something about it. You know, you only have to look at Red Nose Day in this country to know that people will go out and do all sorts of things if they feel it's worth doing. And so, you know, really I think we've got to make it a more acceptable thing for people to think that being efficient in the use of energy is useful. The question then is, what do you say to the farmer in Mali? Sorry chap, you've missed the bus, you're just going to have to take the pain. And that really is an unacceptable formulation, and to some extent carbon finance, which probably will grow. The question is how do you spend it properly, and as someone said this morning, how do you verify that it has been spent properly? I'm not entirely committed to just market mechanisms, but I think a sensible use of legislation which caps things and forces people to invest with a decent checking mechanism might actually build quite a lot of momentum. But putting it through a bureaucracy like the Global Environment Facility might not be the way to do it. It might be that direct investment is a better solution. Our foundation was set up. We were not big, and we decided that we couldn't solve world poverty, world hunger, world environmental degradation. And therefore we decided, how could we increase opportunities and choice for people, and we focus in the drier areas. And what we're really looking at is, where is the system not working? Where are the market failures or breaks, and what can we do about it? And who else wants to do something about it? And what we found as a foundation is there's quite a lot of suspicion of a foundation that sits on the side of an agribusiness company. But what we have found is that by finding other foundations that are corporately funded, they bring a different set of skills, but they bring complementary resources. So just recently we've joined up in East Africa to promote small and medium enterprise in rural areas, working with the Shell Foundation that knows a lot about energy and fuel distribution, Skoll, which is the foundation from eBay that knows a lot about email and electronic issues, Deutsche Bank that knows a lot about credit, and ourselves that we think know a little bit about agriculture. And so there we're bringing our money together in an investment program called GrowFin or Aspire, aimed at promoting small and medium enterprise. Why that? Because actually making governments do things that private sector should be doing is not very sensible. And in many cases, NGOs are filling that gap, and they are recurrently dependent upon grants from either aid donors or governments. So we believe that a viable enterprise sector in rural areas is the basis of growth and also creation of jobs. We will work with others who have there's no point in us all ganging up if we're all agriculture. Otherwise, we just go on doing the same things that everybody's done. What we're looking for is how do we bring together, and I think you saw this in the energy and you're seeing it in everything, no problem can be solved now within a single sector. You said earlier, can any problem be solved within a national boundary? But actually, the old structures of governments where that does energy, that does agriculture, that does forestry, that does trade, is a dysfunction. It's a dysfunction in the system. But those territories remain hardly or very strongly held. What we're interested in is how do you just get on and do something, and how do you not challenge the system but create a mechanism which works. I didn't know what to expect when I was coming, and I looked at the programme and I wondered to what extent I would find it engaging. And it was. And I think the issues that were put on the table were well presented, well articulated, and very interesting. What I couldn't see, what an energy white paper that's coming out would actually resolve unless it created a means by which those differing views could be presented in a way that the public lost its fear of certain technologies and gained in confidence in other areas. Because I think the fear factor, you only have to take BSE and foot and mouth and other things, the fear factor lasts a long time. And Chernobyl has left a lasting impression on many people. The choice was inevitably being cynical or bitter. It's probably better to be slightly cynical. But I think that doesn't stop people saying, if you've got to be optimistic, but at the same time you've got to be realistic. And you've got to have some way, not necessarily holding people to account, but making it clear more widely to a wider group of people when you've got it right and when you've got it wrong. And I don't think the media serves us well.